Pleasure to be here this morning. I know there's a lot of really interesting sessions going on right now. I probably would be in a different one myself if given the opportunity. Yeah, but please don't get up and leave yet. John and I have worked together for about 4 years. John was at Penn State for about 4 years and recently took a faculty position at Cornell. And so he and I have been doing a lot of cover crop work together. And so we're sort of going to tag team this morning. And I'm going to hit on a bunch of different things. Well, two things in particular. And it might be easier that if you have questions or comments as I go along. And actually, I did ask John to tell me when 30 minutes is up so that I can kind of gauge myself or Chad. But so we certainly don't want to consume. I have the ability to go for at least 2 or 2.5 hours if given the opportunity. So I want to make sure that doesn't happen. So I'm going to start off. I'm calling it part 1 and part 2. And part 1 is the impact of herbicides on cover crop establishment. I would say we get asked that a lot, whether there are herbicide programs that are problematic for establishing cover crops, and there are, but I would also say that there are a lot of programs that are not problematic, and so you can make mistakes, and people do make mistakes. It also depends somewhat on where you're living geographically, and so that I should put a caveat out there that my experience is from the Mid-Atlantic region, the Northeastern United States. We're in Indiana right now. I did my graduate work at Illinois on herbicide persistence 30 some years ago, and so it really depends. It's much different in Illinois than it is in Pennsylvania. So I'll try to emphasize that a couple of times as we go along. So I'm talking about residual herbicides. So I would say there isn't anybody certainly growing corn that isn't using residual herbicides, and increasingly now we're using residual herbicides in soybeans. And the purpose of a residual herbicide is to provide weed control for some period of time, right? And so it might be 4 weeks, but more likely it's 8, 12, or maybe even longer. And so when we go out into a field at harvest and it's still clean as a whistle, we know that that herbicide's probably still there or has not been gone for very long. And so this can cause some issues. And I'm going to talk about half-life quite a bit. I found that very useful in talking about herbicide half-lives and how long they persist, and helping people gauge whether there could be a problem or not. And in particular, and I'm just going to touch on this, Dan Talry, who was going to be in this session, but it was a better fit yesterday for him.
No, he's in the session.
Oh, there he is. He snuck in. He talked about interseeding, and that is a particular issue for herbicides, and I'm just going to touch on that. Good to see you here, Dan. So when I think about carryover of herbicides, I think about two things. One is how long does the herbicide persist in the soil? How long or quickly does it dissipate and leave that field? And it can leave that field in a number of ways. And then secondly is how sensitive is the rotational crop? So if I have a persistent herbicide that isn't very active on the crop that I'm seeding, it doesn't really matter. Or if I have a herbicide that's very active on a crop but it doesn't persist, it doesn't matter. And so you have to have sort of both of those to have a problem. It has to last for a while, and it has to be active on the crop that you're seeding. And so this is this concept of half-life. And so here we apply the herbicide. Well, maybe I can use a pointer. We apply the herbicide, it's at 100%, and over time it dissipates. And here we have 50% of the material remaining, 1 half-life, 25%, 2 half-lives, etc. And so I have an example, 2,4-D, which is a short-lived herbicide. It doesn't persist very long. On paper, it has a half-life of about 7 days. So within a month, you've gone through 4 half-lives. That's why we can use 2,4-D in front of soybeans. It's supposed to wait a week to do that, but basically it's gone in a month, and you can plant pretty much any crop following the use of 2,4-D after 30 days. But then we have herbicides like atrazine that we know are more persistent. And the book value for atrazine half-life is 60 days. Actually, there's some recent research that shows that it's probably not that long anymore, and that's going to be a soil type and geography certainly question. But we know that atrazine can persist, and we, not very often anymore, but certainly I would say we used to, when we were using higher rates of atrazine, it wasn't uncommon to see soybean injury on the headlands of cornfields the following year. And so that's one that we need to think about certainly a little bit more.
Can you answer a question?
Yes.
So the half-life of atrazine, the more northern climates, is going to be slower or faster?
So the question is atrazine going to degrade more quickly in the north or in the south? And the simple answer is more slowly where there's colder temperatures. Also, atrazine degradation depends on soil pH, and so high pH allows it to persist longer as well. So high pH, cool climates. So I would say, northern Illinois, Wisconsin, Minnesota, that's where you're going to tend to see more problems with atrazine. Yes?
Would you expect to see half-life differences in conventional versus no-till systems?
Well, you guys are getting way ahead of me here. Would you see, I think I have a couple of slides on that.
Repeat the question.
Yeah. So no-till versus tilled systems, would half-life be different? That's a more complicated question. When you till a soil, so you spray the herbicide, you grow corn, and then that fall you till that soil. That dilutes the herbicide because it mixes it up into a greater zone, plus it stimulates microbial activity. So in that case, you might use that as a remediation tactic if you're concerned about residues. At the same side, a no-till soil, particularly one that's well managed, you're going to have a lot more biological activity. So after the initial application, it could potentially degrade faster in that no-till soil. Anything else? So this is going to be a long 35 minutes. Oh, I jumped ahead of myself. So I sort of categorize these in short, intermediate, and long. And there are short and intermediate. We don't have really any long-lived herbicides that we're using in agriculture. These would be products that are used along roadside rights-of-way, industrial kinds of things that are intended to last for a year or more. But we do have a lot of short, and we have quite a few intermediate. And so you can find herbicide half-life information, and we've published some of this in our extension material. And I think the important thing is that these are not absolutes. And some of these you see ranges. And ranges really are based on experiments that have been done at multiple locations, where in one location, and maybe it's a north-south thing, it could be an east-west thing. As you go west, and I mean farther west where it's dry, and you have high pH soils, herbicides persist a lot longer. As you go south, you got lighter soils, well-drained soils, a lot of moisture, and things really dissipate quickly. So really there is no absolute. I would say things like 2,4-D, it's never going to last, more than, even if you were in a dry, arid climate, that half-life might be 15 days. So that's one that, is not going to persist very long. But something like Callisto, mesotrione, and I'm going to talk more about that, that product really has a wide range of how long it can persist. And I'd say the same thing's true for atrazine. So, you apply a herbicide and a number of things happen to it. The plant takes it up. Some of it may leach, some of it may volatilize. Some products are broken down by sunlight. So there's a lot of things that can happen. This sort of gets back to the question from actually both gentlemen. So we know that soil texture and soil pH can influence dissipation rate. And heavier soils, high clay, high organic matter, they hold on to that herbicide, they absorb it, and it's not available for microbial degradation. And microbial degradation is the primary mechanism that most herbicides dissipate from a field. So heavy soil, high pH. There are some products that persist longer at low pH, but I would say the norm, that's not the norm. Most of us are not farming on low pH soils. Some soils are inherently high pH, or at least certainly they're in the 6s, and you don't see anything low pH wise till you get into maybe the mid 5s or the low 5s, and so hopefully most of you aren't dealing with anything like that. Drought. Drought slows down microbial activity, so that's going to make things persist longer. Application rate. Yeah,
Can I
Dan.
ask a question? This
Yeah.
is just 2012, we had the serious drought. A lot of cover crops planted. There was no herbicide problems. Why?
So drought. When is drought the worst? So the way I sort of look at it is, okay, if we're applying herbicides and they're activated, they get moisture, rainfall. If they're activated and they're controlling the weeds, then their microbes are breaking them down. If we spray them from the get-go and they don't work, then the microbes are not going to break them down. So if we have a mid-season drought, most of the action's already taken place. You know, so my experience with drought was in 1988 in Illinois. So I was fortunate enough, or misfortunate, that one of my years that I did my PhD work, we had that drought, and they had introduced a herbicide called Scepter. And so that was part of my work, and I looked at it 86, 87, and 88. And going into 88, it was not a big problem. All of a sudden, wow, huge difference. And that was a year where we had a drought almost from the very beginning. So that makes a big difference. Pre versus post. So you're spraying products later in the season, post. So there's less time between application and dissipation. We talked a little bit about tillage system already. No-till versus till, you know. Again, most of the advantage for tillage would be trying to remediate a problem that you're concerned about. You know, I think probably in a no-till system where you're managing it well and you have a lot of biological activity, probably that herbicide is going to break down a little more quickly. And then certainly if you're using combinations of products, you know, that could be a problem where you're using 2 or more materials that may be persistent. So these are sort of broad categories, and this is according to Bill Curran. So take that with a grain of salt. You know, products in corn that can last more than 4 months, those are the ones that we tend to be concerned about the most. A lot of 2 to 4, those aren't going to be a problem for the most part with fall seeded cover crops. And then we have things that are, you know, very, very short-lived.
That's based off full rate?
Based off full rate? Yeah, this would be based on normal application rates. Again, grain of salt. This is not black and white. Same sort of thing for soybean herbicides. So you have products that give you full season weed control, ones that you may get some breaks mid-season, and then things that we know don't last very long, right? So that sort of is the persistence piece. Again, the half-life, how long does it last? And then the second piece of this is the sensitivity or susceptibility of the cover crop, if we're talking about cover crops here. Because we know that there's differences in that. And you can look at the products that are potentially problematic, and I have a partial list here. So we talked about atrazine. There's a common trend here, though. Most of the concerns that we have tend to be with small-seeded broadleaves. So legumes, clovers, alfalfa, and then also brassica species, radish, canola. Those are the ones that, for the most part, we have most of the problem with. I would say across the board, at least coming out of corn and soybean programs in the fall. And so mesotrione is Callisto, active ingredient in Callisto. Clemuron is the active ingredient in Classic, and it's a part of a bunch of different products now, Canopy, etc. Imazethapyr is Pursuit, and also a mixture in a number of different products. And so you see a trend there that basically it's the small-seeded dicots or broadleafs that are most problematic. Mesotrione is an interesting one, and so I'm going to, I guess I'm going to focus on that in a minute. We started doing this demonstration. I've probably done this 4 or 5 times now, and it's kind of a neat demonstration. If some of you are in extension or put out plots, it's a herbicide selectivity and persistence demo, and it involves spraying herbicides and seeding cover crops at the same date. You can buy, this is called a log sprayer, and it's a little sprayer that you can fill up with different herbicide treatments in here, in this container. So this is like this is an X-rate of herbicide, this is fresh water. You spray a plot and then you bleed in fresh water and fill this back up. And so it dilutes the herbicide treatment by 50% every time. And so you can put out pretty precise rates of different herbicides in incremental decreases. And so this is an example of the experiment. You put out the herbicides and the seeds on the same day. So ideally you plant the seeds, you put out the herbicides. You want to get rainfall, so you could put out the herbicides and incorporate them. Using this log sprayer, you put out your X rate, or 100%, and then one dilution, 50%, 25, 12.5, etc. And in this case, then we evaluated the plots for percent injury. And basically, we're using herbicide dilution as a proxy for half-life. So think about it. So 1 half-life, 2 half-lives, 3 half-lives. And so it's kind of a neat demo because you can actually see how the herbicides affect the different species, and put out 6 to 8 different cover crop species. And so I have some data that we collected, and I think it's been really useful. You do this with a field day. So here's dual 2, or dual actually, metolachlor, applied at an X rate. In this case, it's 1.67 pints, 1.6 pounds. And we seeded forage radish, ryegrass, hairy vetch, crimson clover, and oats. And so you can see the different rates, right? So 1 through up to 1/16. So here's forage radish. And so what this shows you is that dual is not a very good herbicide on forage radish. I think I got my phone on here. And so even at the high rate, you're getting less than 40% control or reduction in stand. All right. We know that dual, though, is a very good ryegrass or grass herbicide. It's meant to control foxtails, panicums, etc. And so it's pretty good on annual ryegrass. And even at 1/16 X, we're just below 40% reduction in stand. Okay. Then we can look at some of these others. Hairy vetch is not very active on legumes. So hairy vetch, there's the crimson clover line. And then finally oats. And so really, relative to the 5 species that I have here, really it's a grass herbicide, and that's what this sort of shows, that it's most active on grass. So now I can sort of bring in the analogy of half-life into this and think about, well, if I spray that herbicide at 35 days, which is an estimated half-life for metolachlor, I'm down to a half X, 70 days, a quarter X, 105 days, an eighth X, and so on and so forth. So if I go out potentially 4 months and seed a ryegrass, I potentially could reduce that stand still at 4 months after application. And so again, this is sort of simulated, and remember, 35 is not an absolute number. There's a range there, but I would say that that's not uncommon for metolachlor. It's probably around 30, somewhere between 30 and 40 days for a half-life. Another example, this is Pursuit, imazethapyr. Actually, imazethapyr has a longer half-life, 70 days. It may not be that long, but that's what the literature says. And I'm going to bring all these up at the same time. And so we can see that, again, I mentioned I had that one susceptibility. Radish is very sensitive, canola. And so potentially, certainly in the fall, which would be that, that 150 days, say, we could get a reduction in brassica establishment. Legumes are all relatively tolerant to imazethapyr. And actually, it's not a very good grass herbicide. So something, again, that's pretty persistent, and it really depends on the species that you're seeding. And then the last example I have is for rimsulfuron, or Resolve. And Resolve is a short-lived herbicide. It doesn't last very long. And so the literature value for Resolve is a 7-day half-life. And so it's a little bit like 2,4-D. A month after you apply it, there's not much of it left. And so here are the lines for that. And what we see is that it's pretty active on some things, legumes, in particular, and also the radish. But it really doesn't matter because within a month, it's gone, right? So here's an example of one that has a lot of activity on certain species, but it doesn't persist very long. So where do you turn to find this kind of information? So it's better and better all the time, I would say. 5 years ago, it was hard to find much on the persistence of herbicides and cover crop establishment. You could go to management guides, the Purdue, OSU, Illinois guide, our guide. We have recrop tables. You could look at labels, herbicide labels. Just more recently, you can find things that now publish half-life information. And I realize you can't see this. I do realize that now. That is the smallest screen I have ever seen, I would say. But this is from our guide, cherry-picked it, and it shows recrop values. And so, and I've selected some herbicides that are persistent. I'm just going to move on because I can't even see that. You can go to the label. So here's a Callisto label, and it doesn't specifically have a lot of cover crops on it, but it does tell you some information that's useful. 10 months for canola. Okay, that means it's pretty active on brassicas. 18 months for red clover. So that tells you that, and we know alfalfa, the Callisto label's 10 months for alfalfa, the Lumax label's 18 months for alfalfa, or Acuron label too. So we know that just by looking at the recrop label on the label of herbicides, you can glean quite a bit of information. And I've depended a lot on if you know what plant family your cover crop is in, or your cash crop for that matter, you can make a lot of assumptions about how active that herbicide might or might not be. And you may not see this either. This is the table that we started publishing a couple of years ago in our guide, and it provides half-life information, and it's specifically for cover crops. And it's not real specific. There's a lot of mights and maybes in this table, but that's kind of the way it is, that you might get away with this. Maybe you should use some caution, those sorts of things. But it can be still useful and help you make some decisions, hopefully. So, in the end, I mentioned at the very beginning, there are some problem herbicides, but there's a lot of herbicides that are not really much of a problem. How am I doing on time?
23 minutes. Okay.
Oh boy. So this is a list of the ones that I think about. Corn herbicides, atrazine, simazine, mesotrione I mentioned already, isoxaflutol, which is in Balance, Corvus, Prelude, clopyralid, that's not commonly used, but it is in some Dow materials. And I just wanted to focus on the mesotrione one because I'd say this is the one that we have the most problem with for legumes and for mustards. And this is a product that's now off patent. And so there are 15 herbicides in the marketplace, and I may have missed some, that contain mesotrione. Some rates are higher than others. Usually the soil applied rate is like the 6-ounce rate of Callisto. Post-emergence is about 3 ounces, or maybe a little less. But it's important to know when you have mixtures of products, you really need to know what's the active ingredient within those products. So corn or soybean, few products of concern. Chlorimiron, I mentioned already. Imazethapyr. Famecifin, which is in Reflex and Flexstar, that's kind of a bit of a sleeper. People don't realize that persists as long as it does because it doesn't seem like it gives very good residual weed control. But there are some species that are quite sensitive to that. And then wheat herbicides are usually not an issue, I would say. So the general rule is if you can double crop beans after wheat, then you can pretty much seed almost anything. Any questions so far? Yes?
Okay. One of the things we kind of heard or used to hear was that the recropping restrictions were set up more for if you're growing that as forage, where you still might be able to
Yeah.
And I don't know if you are able to offer any comments on, because some of that stuff comes up fine, even though you've got a
Yeah. Yeah, so the recrop restrictions that are placed on these herbicides, what do they really mean? And so you have two reasons why you have recrop restrictions. One is because you're concerned about the residues that could limit your ability to establish the crop, which is what I'm talking about here today. The other reason is that there could be residues that persist that the crop takes up that it's tolerant to, and then you would have illegal residues in the feed or forage if you were to test that, test for that. The first one's kind of a no-brainer. That one's pretty easy. But if you start feeding or foraging cover crops and it's not on the recrop label, then in essence you're breaking the law. And there could be illegal residues in there. And I'm not sure the solution to that, other than if we could try to expand some of these labels that would give more allowance. So if you're growing it for a cover crop, I would say then there's not a problem. If you're growing it as a forage, then you should pay attention to that and make sure that you're within the guidelines.
Are you going to comment on the value of doing a bioassay?
So bioassays, I don't know too many guys that do bioassays. I mean, it sounds like an interesting idea, but it takes at least a month to get the results, and it's now October or November or whatever. So the most common one would be a field bioassay, where you actually plant a strip in a field and see how it looks. But again, from a practical standpoint, you could pull soil samples and then take them into your house, or if you have some sort of a greenhouse opportunity, you could plant things and see whether they respond. But I think you're better off. I mean, if you have a lot of acres and you have a concern, then bioassay may be something. Actually, a greenhouse bioassay might be something that you would do. But in general, it's just not very practical. Yes.
Did you look at any mixes with your cover crop species with your herbicide resistance, see if that played a role in the efficacy?
So how would mixes respond to herbicide residues? What you see is that, so I often see situations where farmers plant mixes. Let's just say they plant ryegrass, clover, and radish, pretty common, and they used a mesotrione product. Basically, you go into that field and the radish, well, there's no clover because it took out the clover. The ryegrass looks great, and the radish is somewhere in between. So you can see the results of that, the selectivity. So that's one thing to think about. A mix does give you some insurance, but you also might be wasting money on adding seed that may be pretty expensive. Yes?
One comment I would add, this past summer, I'm in Nebraska, and there was a field soybean got treated, and I don't remember the herbicide, it was a mistake. Something with triazine got applied. The question was, is it legal to sell the soybeans because it's off-label? And the Nebraska Department of Agriculture, and it might be different in a different state, but their response was, well, yeah, you could sell them, but what you really need to do is have them checked to see if there's a residue level above what's acceptable. And they said we get some of those results, and sometimes when you're off-label, it's above the legal limits for residue, and sometimes it's not. But that was their response, that no, it's not necessarily illegal to not follow that recropping restrictions or a misapplication in this case, but to make it legal, you need to check it with, do a lab analysis and find out if it has a residue level above what's considered acceptable.
Everybody hear that comment? So the gentleman said it was a misapplication. Soybean was the crop that was planted. It survived. It looked pretty normal. And so in order to ensure that it didn't have illegal residues, they had to have them checked with a lab for those residues. Yes, Chris?
I'm just going to follow up on hearsay here, but so one of our weed science guys always says, I've noticed a number of labels list canola plant back restriction at like 18 or 24 months. And I'm like, gosh, there's really this many things that take that long before you plant canola again? And he said, no, he said the companies don't care about canola, so if you don't know, you write down 18 or 24 months. Is there any truth in that?
Well, so there's always a question is the canola is usually 18 months or more plant back, and is that real? And I would say that there always is the other category, which canola used to probably be in. So everything that's not on that label, if I look back to that Callisto slide, there is an other category which is probably at least 18 months, it could be 24 months, and those are the crops that have not been tested, I would say. They're too small acreage. They're not going to do the testing to see whether there's a problem or not. I would say canola is, one of the more sensitive species, though, so it probably does deserve 12 months. Whether it deserves 18 or 24. Sugar beets. We have any sugar beet guys in the room? I mean, that one is like notoriously sensitive to everything. Cotton is always, usually way up there. Tobacco is way up there. So there are crops and cover crops that are pretty sensitive, and they tend to be. Well, canola, it's small seeded and it's a brassica, and these are pretty active on certain crops. Yes.
You had it on one slide where you said, some of these products were traditionally pre-products, and now they're being put post to get water hemp and some to stretch that out. And how much of a is that more than just the half-life and the months, or is it by applying those later has some of the biological degradation been reduced, and do those have even more potential to carry on or not? I guess have you got any feel for that? Well,
so the question is, how important really is that foliar or post application compared to the pre? So if we take mesotrione as the example, it's used pre, it's used post. Fomeciphin, the reflex product, it's going out everywhere in beans for water hemp and for palmer now. On the assumption that a fair amount of that is hitting the soil, that would be the first assumption, that how much of it is intercepted by the crop or the weeds, but particularly the crop, how much of it's hitting the soil. So you do have less of it hitting the soil certainly than you would a pre, but if you're in there, unless it's like a rescue situation, you're still hitting the soil with a fair amount of that, and I think the difference in time is real. So 6 weeks, 8 weeks later than the pre-application. If it turns dry, if it's more likely to turn dry at that point, it's going to be more of a problem. So I think you really need to consider that, that pre versus post. One thing for mesotrione in particular is it's used at half the rate. So what does that do? Okay, so that helps a little bit, certainly. But I think I would be thinking more about that for sure. So I can tell you right now, I'm not going to finish my presentation. Yeah. 35. But we'll see. I'm going to finish with the interseeder thing, and so this is sort of a particular issue, I would say, and so we've been involved in interseeder research since about 2010 now, and actually Dr. Wallace. While at Penn State, he really spearheaded some work that we did at across 3 states where we tried to evaluate some herbicides to see whether it was a problem. And you can imagine, so here, you're going in and seeding the crop 5 or 6 weeks after you used your pre-emerge herbicide. In most of the research that we have been doing, we've been using Roundup Ready corn. We've been spraying glyphosate before we interseed, so we know there aren't residues. But we've tried to find herbicide programs that at least, as I was having a discussion with a young man earlier, that magically disappear about 5 weeks into the season. And that doesn't happen. Nothing, here's the degradation curve, right? It's the half-life curve. So it really sort of depends on where you are on that. And so we've consistently seen issues. Here's one of them with the mesotrione product. I mentioned this. Clovers, brassicas. I can almost always get problems with metolachlor and ryegrass. So those are the two that I would say don't use these. We've tried to put out some things, and I'll be honest with you, we haven't done a great job in my extension program trying to promote this, mostly because I'm dealing with some web issues internally right now. But we tried to develop some tables like this, and it shows, it gives you a green, yellow, red. Green, it's okay. Yellow, caution. Red, don't do it. And we've looked at grass herbicides like you see here, and mostly we focused on ryegrass and clover. Those are the 2 species that we're kind of testing. And you can see some things that Outlook, Harness, that has some opportunity for in ryegrass. If you're seeding red clover, there's a lot of grass herbicides you could probably get away with. If we're looking at broadleaf herbicides, same sort of thing. There's some broadleaf herbicides that we've had a lot of success with, the rimsulfuron or Resolve, Sharpen, which is also in verdict. Atrazine, you know, it's kind of a mixed bag. Can I get away with a pint? What about 2 pints? What kind of soil are you on? If you're in Minnesota and you got a pH of 7, you know, it's going to be a problem. So it really depends on where you are. So some of the conclusions, you know, we've told folks to avoid programs with dual. Zidua's just about like dual. Prowl, sometimes we get away with it, but often we don't. We focused on harness and outlook for grass herbicides. If you're doing ryegrass, mesotrione hardly has any grass activity. So if you're doing a single species, or like the woman asked, if you have a mixture and you got a grass in it, it might take out 2 of the 3, but you'll end up with ryegrass in there. If you're doing legumes, you know, stay away from anything with mesotrione, anything with isoxaflutol, balance, Corvus, again, harness and outlook. You can use probably some dual or Zidua if you're doing legumes. So it really comes down to what you're seeding, and then but if you're interseeding mixtures, you know, then you got to think a little bit more about it, and it becomes a little bit more complicated. And I'm going to stop there, actually.
10 minutes.
You think so?
It's 20 till.
And we go till 11:30. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah. Question on interseeding. What about a cleanup post application? Would obviously Roundup wouldn't have any residual effect, but if you're using something like Status or 2,4-D in corn and then interseeding with that, have you worked at all with any of those?
Yeah. So the question is, what about coming in post? We have done a little bit of that. We've relied on the glyphosate, or you could use glufosinate. You know, Liberty. You know, that's not a problem. We had a trial where we were looking at Status, Clarity. I think we had Lotus, some products that aren't very long lived. We came in a week.
It was about 14 days.
14 days. So 14 days ahead of interseeding. And we had a surprising amount of success, is what I would say. Now, we weren't looking at any of the grass. This was pretty much a dicot broadleaf focus for the herbicide part. But so, for example, we used Status and we used Clarity, and we had clover establishment. So why? Well, rainfall is going to be a big deal there. So if you can get rain, you know, dicamba is really water soluble, so it's gone. But if you got into a dry situation, it could be different. Anything else? All right, I guess I'll keep going then. So the second part is killing cover crops. And so we've spent quite a bit of time trying to think about that. And the way I think about it is sort of these 3 things. When you're selecting herbicides, make sure that you're thinking about the cover crop, but also the weeds that are there. I've run into a number of situations where I'm in mare's tail country, and you got a rye cover crop and it's full of resistant mare's tail, and you want to use glyphosate. Well, you're gonna keep that mare's tail. And I've actually had growers that they now go in a month ahead of time and they hit the rye with 2,4-D to take out the mare's tail, and then they come back and terminate it and plant. Residual herbicides, spray coverage. We haven't done very much in that area, but we think about it quite a bit. And then concern for crop injury from some of the actives. And so I've been promoting mixtures, burn down with mixtures, particularly 2,4-D, for a number of years. And we have guys wanting to plant green now. And so that's going to be a problem in some situations. And so I'm going to just address that a little bit. But the first one, and I realize you're not going to be able to see these slides. So again, tables. You know, it's not a very diverse number of herbicides that we use for burn down. It's a really short list, right? Got 3 herbicides and a group of herbicides. And I bet you 95% of you use the first one. You know, some folks use paraquat, sort of depends. Nobody's using glufosinate, that's kind of a mare's tail selective herbicide. And we have a lot of guys using plant growth regulators. And so I would go to a table like this, again, and look at what cover crop, this is a cover crop burn down table. What cover crop am I growing, and how are the different herbicides rated in terms of effectiveness? And if it's something like cereal rye, you know, that's easy, right? I guess I can look at this. Cereal rye is quite easy. Annual ryegrass, we know that's more challenging. Rapeseed, or if we happen to have radish survive the winter, that you need to think about a little bit more. I'm amazed at the difference between some of the clovers on how sensitive or insensitive they are. Crimson clover is really easy to kill. Medium red clover is more challenging. So you got to look and pick herbicides based on what cover crops you're growing, but then you got to marry that with this table, which are the weeds. So make sure that if you have weeds in there, you're thinking about the herbicide choices that you're making. If you have resistant mare's tail, which most of our growers do now, then that's something that you certainly want to take into account. And I'm sure this is a review for most of you, but there are some issues with some of these burn down herbicides. You know, glyphosate is a good example. Glyphosate is a pretty good grass herbicide. That's really its strength. It has some weaknesses relative to broadleaves. Legumes, it's not very good on legumes. That's probably one of the most common things. But that last bullet point, glyphosate works best if you're using it by itself. So you make sure it has a good surfactant with it and some ammonium sulfate. You start mixing it with things, and again, I know a lot of you guys know this, you can run into some antagonism issues. Example, this is one of our plots from 2016. The intent was not to do this. This is just what happened. We're at cereal rye, where you look at glyphosate by itself and then mixtures with metribuzin. And metribuzin is becoming more common again in a soybean system. And you probably lose 50% of your activity, I would estimate, when you tank mix with metribuzin, atrazine, simazine, something like that. In the end, you know, it all died, but you could still see, this is 22 days after, you can kind of still see those areas. And so we had a pretty, 32 ounces of a Roundup product is a pretty stout rate. If I was at 22, it might not have died. And there's a lot of products that have triazines in them, right? And this is just a partial list, corn and soybean. So if you're trying to kill something that can be challenging to kill to begin with, and you're reducing your glyphosate activity by 50%, and then maybe you're out there early and it's cold, and that reduces it by 50% again, that's where you tend to start running into the problems. So the other one I thought I'd just throw up here was the paraquat one, or the gramoxone, because I find that also interesting. And I'd say this is increasing in use for sure. It's not used. Probably the biggest reason it's not used is because that last statement is restricted use, and it has the highest acute toxicity of any herbicide that we're currently using in the marketplace. But what I find interesting here is that you want to tank mix it. You want to tank mix it with a triazine, unlike the atrazine, or unlike the glyphosate. You want to mix it with atrazine or simazine or metribuzin because you get a lot better activity. And there's a number of other things you need to think about, right, too. So this was a trial we did a number of years ago, just side by side, gramoxone plus metribuzin on cereal rye versus without. And it can be pretty striking, the advantage that you get. And in this case, you go back a couple of weeks later, and that gramoxone alone did not completely control the cereal rye. Now, this isn't going to be a problem usually, but it could be. So the last part, residual herbicides and injury. I started thinking more about this with the idea of planting green. We have quite a few farmers that are involved in this now. I've heard quite a bit about this at the conference here in the last 2 days. We have a really active, there's a Pennsylvania No-Till Alliance, and these guys are hugely committed to no-till and are trying to get the best and the most out of their cover crops. So I've been involved in a few experiments, few field trials. We have a graduate student, Heidi Meyer. She's finishing up her PhD, and she's had a project now. She conducted it for 3 years at 5 locations, so she's got 15 site years, and she's been looking at performance in corn and beans, and slugs was a big part of it. I'm in slug country, and there was some thought that planting green might help manage slugs. I would say the jury's still out on that, is what I'm hearing anyway. I was more worried about some of the herbicide programs that are used in these systems, and so I'd been involved in doing some experiments. We have another graduate student named Jess Bunchek who's working on her master's degree, and I was worried about efficacy of herbicides in these cover crops. And I say we're just sort of dabbling in this. But you can imagine spraying no cover or rye cover and then some mixture that, particularly something like hairy vetch, which is real viney and big, and how much of that herbicide hits the ground. And so I don't have a lot of results to present today, but I can tell you there is an impact. And so these are some spray cards that we had been using in some of her work. If you're trying to kill mare's tail underneath that cover crop with a herbicide program, or you're using a residual herbicide, you need to think about how much of that herbicide is reaching the target. That could be a weed, or that could be the soil. So I think about may lose performance if applying to large mature cover crops. This is residual and contact type herbicides. I think it's a particular problem for hidden weeds or for soil applied herbicide distribution. If you're standing above the cover and you can see the soil, it's probably not going to be too big a deal. But if you're looking down and everything's covered, that could be a problem. Systemic herbicides are going to be less problematic than contact type herbicides. We played a little bit with nozzle selection. Those were air induction tips that I showed you on the spray card. So that's already a big droplet. If you were to use a finer droplet, which of course we're trying to move away from with all the concerns for drift, that could potentially be helpful, but still. So really the idea of do I need to make a separate application, I think those of you that are involved in some of this probably have a lot more experience than I do on whether that's necessary or not. Okay.
For burn down on broadleaves in planting green, one question we've had is there's often restrictions on planting. If the label says you shouldn't plant within 14 days of spraying, particularly on broadleaf herbicides. Do you know what you guys were using? I saw you had that shit in there.
Could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
What broadleaf herbicide are you using to burn down in planting green scenarios?
So typically you'd be tang mixing 2,4-D, could be dicamba. 2,4-D is the one that probably is most commonly used in our area, and we know that's a problem. You're not going to be able to do that in soybean, at least until next year, when we might have enlist soybean. Same thing for corn. The concern for corn is that if you spray and plant, or plant and spray right away, and you get a rainfall and you wash that that herbicide into the seed zone, you can have issues with that. So ideally, if you could spray a week ahead of time or a week after you plant, after the seed is imbibed, it's safer to do so. So there's some restrictions about planting and spraying at the same time.